Welcome to Buildings and Beyond,
the podcast that explores how we can create a more sustainable built environment
by focusing on efficiency, accessibility, and health.
I'm Rob Aldrich.
And I'm Kelly Westby. By now, I bet you've heard of it. The Climate Mobilization Act, or what most people seem to be calling it, New York City's Green New Deal, which City Council passed on Thursday, April 18th. The act is a package of bills geared towards reducing the city's emissions. The package includes one bill ordering the city to complete a study over the next 2 years on the feasibility of replacing oil and gas burning power plants. Another establishes an energy loan program. 2 more require certain buildings to cover their roofs with plants, solar panels, and small wind turbines, or a mix. And the final adjusts the city's building code to make it easier to build wind turbines. Today, though, we are going to focus in on yet another bill in this package, one that the City Council referred to as the centerpiece. The bottom line is that New York City buildings account for almost 70% of carbon emissions, and in order to achieve the city's goals of reducing emissions by 80% by 2050, the City Council believes building owners must take action now. Whatever your thoughts were on the initial bill, on the process of enactment, or on the final version passed on Thursday, everyone in the industry, from REBNY to City Council to sustainability organizations such as Urban Green, can agree that this is a really big deal. Marc Zuluaga has been working at SWA for almost 20 years and has been one of many people involved in the development of New York City's climate policies, from serving on the New York City Green Code Task Force in 2010 and continuing to work with Urban Green as an advisor on the most recent round of legislation. Marc urges us all to focus on the future. What does this really mean for the building industry, and what do we need to do to set us up to successfully meet these targets? So Marc, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So what big things are happening in the city. We're here today to talk about one portion of the Climate Mobilization Act and the part that focuses on decarbonization of buildings. Can you just start by giving us a little background? Why are we paying attention to this bill? Where did it come from?
Sure. So, and we're recording on Friday in advance of the signing, right? We don't know the new local law name yet at this taping, but Introduction 1253 was just passed by the City Council, and it's a pretty sweeping new local law that will kind of require dramatic changes and reductions in how existing buildings that are bigger than 25,000 square feet, which is about 3 billion square feet of New York City, how they use energy, specifically requiring kind of pretty significant reductions across the board for most buildings in this kind of segment of the city.
And why are we so focused on buildings in New York City? How does this relate to our larger climate change goals? Sure.
So, approximately, at least 70% of the GHG emissions in New York come from the building sector. So you can't meet the near or long-term carbon reduction goals that the city has without addressing buildings. And maybe to take two steps back while we're talking about this New York bill, this whole thing is very much in line with actions that other cities are taking or at least evaluating. Washington, D.C. recently passed their own existing buildings performance-based bill, and many other cities are also looking at both D.C. and New York as models to kind of replicate over the coming years, kind of like the no smoking thing started in New York a long time ago under Bloomberg, and then slowly got rolled out internationally.
That's an excellent point. And I, for one, am definitely thankful that we have banned smoking in buildings. So I think that was a good move, and hopefully this one will be too. Focusing in a little bit on how does this bill actually roll out? What are we looking at? What exactly are the targets in it?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's pretty abstract stuff, and I think one important thing to understand is just the context. To get just an initial feel for the scope. The city council, the mayor, the drafters of the bill, and a large cross section of the industry that has been engaged over the past year or two on this subject has really approached this as a departure from business as usual. Based on the severity of climate change and what the IPCC and other reports tell us. So this is very much a big change from going back to the early Bloomberg administration's policies that were more around just providing the market with information, like energy benchmarking to provide owners with information on how much energy they're using, or even energy audits, which give owners recommendations on how to change their buildings, but don't require any action. So this bill is very much breaking out of that mold and actually requiring these significant retrofits in buildings, and it's using a carbon-based kind of carbon intensity metric to sort of guide the market towards these kinds of retrofits. So specifically. Buildings will have, depending on if they're office buildings or multifamily or storage buildings or schools, will have a carbon target per square foot. The carbon target's calculated by adding up all the owner paid and tenant as well energy used in the building, dividing by the square footage and converting to kind of carbon emissions, and that's how you get your intensity and the fines that will be used to sort of spur action will be proportional to how much any one building is over their carbon budget, starting in 2024 being the first year that the targets will be in place. After that, it'll ratchet down in 2029 to a deeper targets, and then to even a greater degree in years after 2030.
Wow, that is a lot to cover. So maybe we'll break it down a little bit, piece by piece. And I sort of led you to a broad overview of the legislation, which is great. Taking a little bit of a step back to what you were first talking about, that this kind of is a departure from the initial set of laws about information gathering. Would you also say, though, that we kind of needed to start with the laws of information gathering before we got into setting these caps? Was that information used in determining, what these caps should be, or was that a necessary step, or was it a step that we thought would have more of an impact and then didn't?
Going back, I think it's been 10 years-ish since the initial benchmarking law was passed. I certainly didn't have any, grand idea of what would happen after that, and I don't know if it was an unintended consequence or not, but maybe it was, really, core to the intent. But I think the amount of information we know about buildings as a result of these kind of public disclosure laws has, substantially increased. And, that's been helpful to understand kind of how buildings are doing at the individual level, but it's also been very helpful to policymakers to understand kind of globally how buildings are being, how they're performing, relative to peers at scale. And that kind of data certainly informed the sort of framework for setting these new targets, which are set at kind of percentages such that in 2024, maybe just the outlier buildings, the 10-15% most carbon intensity would be kind of caught by that cap, but the 2030 numbers would catch a much greater degree of the market, and that's all based on the data that has been collected going back to the early Bloomberg days. So yes, the two are definitely very much tied together, and the fact that other cities have also enacted public disclosure and benchmarking is I think allows for kind of greater compatibility in these policies across cities, which is which is probably, although I don't think owners probably love a lot of this stuff. I think at least the idea of having some standard approach across different markets is probably better than everybody doing it 17 different ways. But at this point, it's just New York and DC that have kind of taken the plunge with this kind of performance-based requirement.
Great. And then the cap you talked about, and you talked about sort of the rollout a little bit. Let's dive in maybe to the timeline specifically first. There's 2024, there's a 2030, there's 2050. What's the rollout supposed to look like, and can you kind of describe that timeline?
Sure. So just like every building, reports their energy benchmarking information on an annual basis, starting, and has for a while. Starting in 2024, there'll be call it a more robust reporting that sort of certifies the energy use and square footage and space programming of particular buildings for basically defining effectively a carbon intensity for that building, kind of like you're doing your taxes basically, and that building will be then compared to what the relevant target threshold is for its use type. And if it's over the use type, then there'll be a fine leveled kind of in proportion for every year thereafter. So after 2024 and 2025 and 2026, it'll be relative to one target, and there'll be fines on an annual basis. Starting with the 2029 performance, the target will ratchet down, and the fines would continue if no retrofits or upgrades have been done to sort of get the buildings under compliance.
What are those fines really going to look like for a typical building in New York?
Well, hopefully a typical building in New York by 2030 has zero fines. I mean, that's the intent, that upgrades are made such that the carbon footprint goes down, and there's no fines issued. But for any buildings that for whatever reasons don't implement upgrades, the fines are pretty steep, and I think are intended to send a strong signal to the market. So buildings that today don't do anything for the next 10 years could stand to be fined on the order of 20, 30, 40, 50, 80 cents a square foot or more. That's pretty significant. That's kind of for a residential building, as much as an owner paid expenses might be to operate the building for utility costs. Again, I don't anticipate a situation where buildings do absolutely nothing, since these fines are so significant. But if any buildings don't do anything over the next 10 years, the fines will be quite steep, and I think as a result spur a lot of action.
Right, and there are also the sort of question, and maybe the analogy to the car industry, of how might people try to get around writing down how much they're actually consuming, and how might they try to maybe tweak their numbers a little bit? Has the city put in place any ways of making sure that owners don't do that?
I think in enforcement is I'm not sure what the exact plans are, but will be, as with any law, critical. I think that the kind of simplicity of the metric, it's really just your square footage and your total energy use and your space programming is all that's reported, will make sort of administration more straightforward. That said, if you read the law, there's language on, just like a accountant who prepares someone's taxes. There's some pretty severe penalties for anyone that misrepresents data. And I think the only thing to that's probably not reported, from the utility is oil use. I don't know if there'll be a market for oil deliveries that aren't don't show up in building owners' energy records, but I imagine that some smart regulations can probably level the playing field for that sort of thing. But that's not, the enforcement thing is not really my department, but I imagine there's people that'll be looking pretty closely at that.
Right, that's great. And the fines on misrepresenting, I think, can be up to 10 times the fines for poor performance. So definitely incentivizing putting the right things down, even if your building is consuming more. And the targets have been defined already here in the legislation that was voted on yesterday. You talked a little bit about how they're carbon-based targets, but the building owners maybe are more used to seeing their energy information based on energy benchmarking that's been around for a long time. Why the move to a carbon-based target for us, and what does that mean for the industry, and how is that going to be translated?
Sure. I guess it's my understanding that the if the goals in terms of 80% carbon reductions by 2050 or 40% by 2030, which this legislation is intended to sort of support both. If the goals are in terms of carbon, the thinking, I guess, is that the most efficient metric is to actually use a carbon metric. And that's probably the best way of allocating societal resources to meet these long-term goals. I think owners think primarily in terms of dollars. I think there are some owners who are closely looking at their Energy Star portfolio manager benchmarking and know what the difference is between source EUI and site EUI and that sort of thing. But I think most of the market thinks in terms of dollars. Carbon is different from dollars, and carbon is also different from energy. Most notably is it's not just about how much energy you use per site, but it's the source of that energy. So, for example, number 2 oil has about a 40% higher carbon footprint for every BTU delivered compared to natural gas. So even 2 buildings that have the same energy use per square foot will have dramatically different carbon footprints if one's on oil and one's on gas. So I think it's basically providing the market with a more than just energy efficiency signal, and that's I guess that's the intent of the metric.
Great, that's a really good point, and I think there's maybe some confusion, even potentially internally. I think the law requires a Office of Energy Performance, but like you're saying, if you reduce the energy consumption in one building, that's one way to meet the target. But in one building, maybe another way to look at reducing carbon is actually a fuel switch that maybe doesn't save energy per se.
Sure.
Great. And kind of moving us then in that direction, unless I've missed something, you want to pull me back, but thinking a little bit about, okay, I'm a building owner and I'm maybe not sure where I'm going to fit in this. Is there anything I can do to see what my carbon intensity is right now? What factors are they using for this law? What factors will be in place for the 2024? And do those factors change? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The law specifies what factors should be used for the 2024. So specifically, you can take the public disclosure benchmarking that you're doing anyways, and easily convert that to get a sense of what your carbon footprint is. Obviously, things like square footage become important, even if you have the energy use of your building down pat. If you're off 15% on your square footage, then you're off 15% on your carbon footprint. One way or another, and I think there'll be sort of increasing attention to sort of the accuracy of some of that information that goes into benchmarking as a result. But bottom line, it's a pretty straightforward exercise to get a basic sense of where you stand for any one building relative to the 2024 target. One thing as you kind of set up to keep in mind is that the carbon impact of electricity depends on what's going on with the Con Edison in New York, at least, and the electricity grid. And if solar panels and wind turbines are being used to generate that electricity, or if gas power plants are being used, that's obviously a moving target. And the carbon footprint of electricity, the sort of way an owner would convert their electricity consumption to carbon, is defined for 2024, but left to be defined in the coming year based on further study for the years 2030 and beyond. There's a lot of discussion in the industry about electrification. The governor made a pretty bold announcement in January that New York State would be 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. So while the grid is what it is today, it's likely to change significantly. No one has a crystal ball on how fast Indian Point Power Plant, that's a nuclear plant that supplies a lot of carbon-free electricity in New York City, is going to go offline in the coming years. But then on the other hand, there's going to be a ramp up of offshore wind plans. So that number for 2030 and beyond is going to require a little bit more careful study to set appropriately for owners so that they have the right long-term signal and plan, because nobody wants a moving target, that changes from year to year. Everybody, I think the market requires a pretty steady long-term signal to make these significant, investments that will be required to get buildings under the limits.
Right, and I think that's interesting to that point. I think some building owners were surprised on the portfolio manager score to that effect, right? You're scored on a curve for portfolio managers specifically, and so that can be difficult. If everybody else improves, then your building worsens by comparison. But that's an interesting reason to just have this sort of cap target per square foot carbon emissions target, rather than a percent better than other people or percent better than yourself.
Sure, and there was a lot of industry discussion about the best approaches to this. DC is taking a different approach and using more of an Energy Star kind of percentage-based framework. And I don't think anyone knows what the perfect right answer. But I think any of the approaches that had been discussed over the past years would involve a pretty substantial shakeup of a system, if you want to consider the New York City real estate or DC real estate as having a lot of inertia, and these changes are certainly intended to spur more action around scaling up retrofits than frankly the market has any idea of how to deliver, and that's the market of energy consultants like Stephen Winter Associates, contractors, property managers, owners. This is going to be a new and big thing for the entire industry, and I think move some of these opportunities to evaluate one technology or another more to the top of the pile when it comes to real estate asset management in general.
Right, I think that's a great point, and I think we didn't even necessarily start this conversation by putting it in that context of, people are saying or Huffington Post says this is likely the largest single legislative mandate to cut climate pollution by any city in the world. This is really supposed to be a big deal. It is a big deal, and we're going to see how that shakes out in the market, kind of like you said.
Yeah, and we can talk about a couple. We've even today so far gotten into just kind of the broad strokes of it. Of course, there's devils in details and variances and exceptions that are at least worth also speaking to. But probably the big one for that applies kind of most significantly in New York is a sort of a different approach taken for any buildings with rent-regulated apartments, which applies to a very large fraction. I believe it's up to 50%. That may not be exactly correct, but it's a a very substantial fraction of the multifamily market in New York has at least one rent-regulated apartment. The discussions over the past year or two on this topic there's been a lot of concern of energy upgrades being passed through by owners and resulting in significant rent hikes. So a different approach has been taken for these buildings, and they'll be subject to implementing a kind of a prescriptive list of energy upgrades by 2024 that, since these tend to be simpler pre-war type buildings, involves kind of thermostatic controls in apartments and wireless sensors to make boilers, actually respond to the temperatures inside buildings as opposed to guessing based on outside temperature, and a few other kind of lower cost items that'll have to be, documented and implemented by 2024. So that's one kind of important exception to kind of keep in mind, and there's probably a few others that are worth talking about as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. The sort of discussion around affordable housing versus energy efficiency and how that's come about in this and been covered and carved out in this legislation. So, moving those buildings forward and not completely allowing, nothing to take place, but providing a way to maintain some of the affordable housing that we need across the city.
Sure. Yeah, they're two big important goals.
And are there any other carve-outs you mentioned that or differences or variances that are important to talk about?
Sure, and maybe I guess carve-out isn't the right word, but that I used before. But kind of additional considerations. There's a big potential opportunity to evaluate kind of effectively deductions for renewable energy credits, RECs, involving the kind of purchase of carbon-free electricity, and then if your building uses electricity and you purchase that carbon-free electricity, then that's sort of included in your in your reporting, so you don't have to actually get penalized from a carbon standpoint for any of that electricity. There's some to be, I think, ironed out during the rulemaking. Important details around what constitutes a REC credit for a clean supply, and this is something that can't just be done once; would have to be done on an annual basis. But definitely something that would be important for any building to evaluate relative to kind of other capital investments to meet a particular target. There's also potential, even less defined, I guess, to date, greenhouse gas offsets that and credits that might be used to help buildings comply. And finally, there's something that a lot of people are excited about, including myself, but something that I think needs also a lot of further study. There's a recommendation to have advisory group look at the potential to allow for carbon trading and a true kind of carbon trading market kind of across buildings, to help buildings comply with the standards, to help owners of large portfolios, allocate resources. Maybe they're doing a major capital project anyways in one building and want to go deeper in one building, and then with other buildings, wait till a capital cycle, that's after after 2030 or after 2024. So as a way of just providing the market more flexibility, everybody's kind of pretty excited about the potential for trading between buildings, but that is something that would be, a few details would need to be figured out to have a real viable approach for that, and that's going to require more careful study. But it's something that we should all keep our eyes on.
That's great, and that alludes to the advisory panel that's built into the law itself, right? So there are rules about buildings built into the law and these carbon caps, but there's also a new Office of Energy I'm going to say that wrong, energy management or something, building energy performance. That's the right one, which we alluded to before. And then there's also an advisory panel to that new part of the government. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's while the bill itself has a lot of technical details in it. To apply to a city with 3 billion square feet of real estate above 25,000 square feet, there's a lot more that needs to get thought through, as with any law, in the rulemaking stage and beyond. And then there's some, in addition to the carbon trading, opportunity, there's some additional pretty thorny considerations that'll need to be evaluated from a lot of different perspectives over time, including what those targets should be beyond 2030, where you're really getting into what are the physical limits of buildings, and then like we discussed before, what should the carbon footprint of electricity be in the future, in addition to being a fixed number, since no one has a crystal ball, but certainty is good for planning. There's also a lot of thinking that it's going to take the grid probably 20 plus years to substantially clean up, or exactly 20 years if the governor's plan holds through for New York State. And it's going to take buildings that much time to also upgrade their infrastructure with efficient electric heat pumps that are just starting in the pilot phase in bigger buildings in New York. And for building owners to make the decision, maybe not this year or next year, but closer to 2030 and soon after 2030, decisions are going to have to be made between do I double down on my existing fossil fuel-based system, or do I implement a new heat pump that maybe also provides cooling as an amenity and increases building value? We're kind of far from being able to do that at scale, but frankly, for innovation to happen in the market, a long-term signal that favors electrification is something that would be very helpful. And the other thing that would be very helpful is for us to learn about these new technologies over the next few years, so we learn what works, what doesn't work, and how to sort of scale up them when the time is right, and when the grid, in tandem with supporting the grid. So that's something that is obviously a pretty complex question that needs a lot more further study from a variety of perspectives, and that's one of the things that the advisory committee will be charged with looking into more closely.
Great. And you mentioned a little bit heat pumps. Not that necessarily that heat pumps aren't being used at scale on the heating and cooling side. Are you specifically referring to heat pumps for other applications like domestic hot water?
Sure. I mean, the whole. I mean, in broad strokes, the bumper sticker climate solution is to electrify everything, meaning anything that burns something right now, and then get the carbon out of the electricity supply with wind, solar, batteries, hydro, and nuclear. Easier said than done, but basically anything we're burning right now is certainly a candidate for electrification in terms of building systems. Where it makes sense to start first is sort of the more important question probably, and there are heat pumps that can actually take BTUs out of the outdoor air and make hot water, and be used in some cases to lessen Con Ed's peak winter gas demand problems in certain targeted neighborhoods. And there's obviously the VRF and mini split type heat pumps that can be used to provide space conditioning and comfort cooling, and I think are certainly superior to our kind of typical in a residential setting steam radiator and window air conditioner type setup, but obviously also considerably expensive to retrofit. So those are the kinds of technologies the market really needs to sort of test out and evaluate more in the context of bigger buildings, because I think they're further along in smaller 1 to 4 family homes in other parts of the country. But I think the bigger building retrofit of those kinds of technologies is still very much a new thing to the New York market in particular.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And shout out to Rob and his podcast last season on the smaller 1 to 4 family home lessons learned from heat pump installation that I think can definitely apply, or at least we should definitely be thinking about as we scale up that type of technology to larger buildings. We should think about what we've learned from the single family and small multifamily space that would apply here as well.
Sure, and maybe these new technologies are need to be evaluated and piloted by the early adopters. But just so there's not kind of any confusion, I think the for a typical residential building, so especially an older kind of pre-war one that burns a lot of fuel, probably the most likely and common path to get that building to the 2030 compliance level will be around getting the steam system balanced and working and using that fuel as efficiently as possible. It's sort of after 2030 that I think folks will really need to be looking at heat pumps at very, very significant scale for especially space heating. And on the commercial office side, it's worth pointing out, as has been pointed out by many large owners, that tenants drive the carbon footprint with their electricity use, plug loads, and lighting within tenant spaces. More than anything, often more than 50% of a large office building's footprint. So that will require strategies that have to be put in place over time to implement upgrades at when it makes sense from a real estate standpoint at turnovers and fit outs in order to address the tenant load, which is really out of the owner's kind of a direct control. So, definitely there'll be, I think, more of a focus on tenants in general and behavior with this kind of performance standard, because as opposed to energy efficiency, where it's one motor is 82% efficient, the other one's 84. I mean, behavior and how these devices and appliances are used is what's going to drive ultimate carbon performance as much as anything, and that's something that the industry as a whole hasn't really grappled with too much.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think in that world, do you think there is, is this a lease language kind of forced capture of these energy efficiency measures, or putting that into the lease language that tenants are required to fit those out? Or do you think that's going to be easier to sort of be we now take that out of the responsibility of the tenants and the building owner is supposed to be doing some of this work? Or are we going to see sort of different methods from different owners of how to move this forward?
I don't pretend to know the what's going to make the most sense for every kind of building and ownership type. I think this is a big new thing that is going to need to be evaluated closely, and I think kind of because of the nature of the goals, everything probably should be on the table, from looking at your leases to your staging your fit outs in a certain way, and obviously building on planned CapEx work that you're doing anyways, looking at more discretionary projects in a strategic way to reduce energy use and hopefully also add other values to buildings. And I think there's gonna emerge some pretty standardized packages for most kind of the main building typologies and ownership structures in the city, but and in concert with the renewable energy credits and greenhouse gas offsets, I don't think there's going to be a perfect one-size-fits-all strategy, and it's something that I think Well, I'm a procrastinator. I think the most cost-effective way for the market to really respond to this is to at least start planning soon and understand, what they might have to do to meet these targets. It doesn't mean you have to do major capital projects tomorrow, but I think you should probably be in any building's owner's interest in knowing sooner rather than later what will be involved, so that everything can be approached kind of as systematically as possible.
And realistically, 2024 is really not that far away.
Sure, and again, the 2024 cap was intended to catch maybe the most egregious kind of waste, the type of stuff that could be addressed through retro commissioning in a maybe a typical retro commissioning or typical residential building with maybe steam leaks or that sort of thing. That said, I think everybody recognizes that there is a difference between energy or carbon intensity and energy efficiency. There's certainly some very large buildings that have efficient systems but have very intense kind of uses and tenants, and may find it challenging to move the needle very fast in as a result of the nature of the building. So I think the 2024 standard will be something that any building that's over it and has kind of egregious waste probably has reasons that they've been I guess you could say wasting that energy to date, and some of them could be good reasons, some of them could be bad reasons, but those are buildings that are gonna need to move certainly pretty fast to get things in place by 2024.
Great, and that's an excellent point. I think and maybe alluding to, there's a downside to everything, but I think there's an idea that there's a tension between this, targeting bigger buildings because they have higher carbon emissions, and so if we really want to make a stab at the carbon emissions in the city, we have to focus on kind of large buildings, but they are. We're talking about a per square foot basis. So technically speaking, if it's a very large but empty building, you're going to use less carbon than a very large but full building. And so there is this a little bit of a tension there. But as far as moving the needle towards a world where we're not increasing temperatures across the globe, we have to be thinking about how we're consuming energy at any level. And we need to find a metric, and the sort of per square foot basis, I think, is the only way that made the most sense in the city here.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, just kind of looking forward, it is what it is, and it's. I think the question to answer is, what's the most cost-effective approach for any building to kind of meet these targets, and I think looking at these, this just as a carbon reduction thing is probably a missed opportunity to see, what can you do that improves tenant experience, adds to the asset value, reduces or simplifies maintenance, and then also reduces carbon footprint. I think that's probably a better way of looking at it than just as what can I do to minimize this carbon fine.
Great point. And do you have any other recommendations? You said start looking at how your building's using energy now and what kinds of things you'd have to put in place to meet the 2024 and 2030 goals. Maybe start by looking at that retro commissioning study and tuning up your building. What else should I be looking at as a building owner or as an operator?
I think knowing where you stand is probably step one, and that means looking at your benchmarking data, but also making sure that the benchmarking data is accurate, including not just the energy and the space programming type, but the square footage, and then having a sense of what kinds of changes you can make in your building over time, or you would have to make in your building over time to meet either the 2024 or the 2030 targets. I think is just step one, and then what any building owner does with that information is going to depend on a bunch of different circumstances. But I think not knowing where you stand or what you might have to do to meet the target till midway through the 2020s will put buildings in a kind of a reduce flexibility and reduce options and increase costs ultimately.
Great. And I think you've really pitched the idea of, there's a lot of buzz around smart buildings and what smart buildings really mean. And to you, I think, maybe you can describe this a little bit better, but that a smart building is not necessarily just this strapping sensors on all different places and watching everything, but being smart about how you're distributing steam through your building and balancing steam and being smart about how you're ventilating. And, can you speak a little bit about how that might apply to how building owners can view this and what kinds of moves they have to make in the next couple of years?
Sure. Well, I think while building in the tech world, owners kind of, or the market kind of likes new for the sake of new. I think building owners for good reasons generally like old for the sake of old, and so I think there hasn't quite been as much disruption yet in the real estate space with kind of emerging technologies as in other sectors. That said, I think there's everyone's looking closely at what new technologies are available with wireless communication and enhanced controls that can be from a retrofit standpoint, especially just kind of layered on to existing buildings kind of seamlessly. And I think there are increasing options, obviously, for these kinds of technology solutions in the coming years, and they're options that we really didn't have, in a meaningful way, 5 to 10 years ago. So that's great. That said, we have old infrastructure, old steam systems, old ventilation systems that can't just be addressed by putting a new wireless sensor on them. So I think there's a need to both look at the kind of meat and potatoes kind of infrastructure, steam balancing, leaky window air conditioner type issues we see in our buildings and marry those with also kind of new communication and wireless sensors to, again, ultimately deliver a better tenant experience and more attractive asset to the market, in addition to also reducing carbon. So I think you have to do both the new technology and the old technology to meet these goals, and it's good to have both together because I think without some of these newer options, owners would have much more difficulty. And I think broadly speaking, I would consider a building smart if it does both. If it has the pipes balanced and has the sensors in place, and then puts the two together to the benefit of all the people that are associated with the building, including the service contractor, including the property manager, including the owner, including the folks that kind of live and work in the buildings.
That's a great point. And I know, a quick plug, I know you've worked a lot on this smartbuildings.nyc. So if anybody wants some more information in that world, they should definitely check that out. And I think the last thing that we like to end on is, and we have a lot that's going to happen in the next 5 years. We'll be about right there at 2024. What do you think we're going to be saying when we have you back on the podcast in 5 years?
In 5 years, I think I'll be excited to have learned about how kind of New York steps up to this challenge with innovation, really, to solve this problem, and I think we'll probably have a much better sense of, what makes sense where. And I think I feel for owners that get pitched from a lot of snake oil and other vendors saying they have a magic box to save this much energy here or there. But I think the dust will settle in the next few years, and there'll be some pretty standardized and robust and proven approaches that the market can have confidence in to implement, and that'll be an exciting thing to be a part of. But I think it'll also require some pain and brain damage, frankly, in the next few years to kind of figure that out. I think that's where we'll be 5 years ish from now.
Thanks. I think that's a great answer. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. So thank you so much for being on the podcast with me this morning and talking us through the next 5 years.
Great. Well, looking forward to talking more between now and then too.
Thank you for listening to Buildings and Beyond. For more information about the topics discussed today, visit www.swinter.com/podcast and check out the episode show notes. Buildings and Beyond is brought to you by Stephen Winter Associates. We provide energy, green building, and accessibility consulting services to improve the built environment. Our professionals have led the way since 1972 in the development of best practices to achieve high-performance buildings. Our production team for today's episode includes Dylan Martello, Alex Mirable, and myself, Heather Breslin. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.